Before any European ships ever reached its shores, the land we now call Delaware was home to a vibrant and ancient people. For thousands of years, Native Americans lived here, their lives deeply connected to the rivers, forests, and the Great Bay that define the region. They were known as the Lenape, or the original people. They built their villages near the water, which provided them with fish, shellfish, and a means of travel. Their world was one of seasons, a rhythm of hunting in the deep woods for deer and bear, and planting crops like corn, beans, and squash in the fertile soil near their homes. Their society was carefully organized, with families and clans that held deep respect for their elders and their traditions. The Lenape were not one single group, but a collection of communities that shared a common language and culture. They lived in homes called wigwams, which were made from wooden frames and covered with bark or animal hides. They were skilled craftspeople, making tools from stone and bone, and pottery from the local clay. Stories and histories were passed down from one generation to the next, not through written words, but through the spoken tales of storytellers around the campfires. These stories taught the children about their ancestors, the spirits of the natural world, and the right way to live in harmony with the earth. It was a life of balance, community, and profound connection to the land. Life for the Lenape was guided by the changing of the seasons. In the spring, they would gather in larger villages to plant their fields and celebrate the renewal of life. Summer was a time for tending to the crops and fishing in the abundant waters of the Delaware River and Bay. When autumn arrived, the harvest was gathered, and families would move to their hunting grounds for the winter. This seasonal movement was not aimless wandering, it was a carefully planned cycle that ensured they had enough food and resources to survive. The Lenape understood the land intimately, knowing where to find the best clay for pots, the strongest wood for bows, and the most effective plants for medicine. The arrival of the first Europeans in the early 1600s would bring about a change so profound that the Lenape world would be altered forever. At first there was curiosity and trade. The Lenape offered furs and food in exchange for metal tools, cloth, and glass beads. But soon these newcomers brought things the Lenape had never known. New diseases that their bodies could not fight, and a completely different idea about owning the land. For the Lenape, land was something to be shared and used by all, like the air they breathed. For the Europeans, it was something to be bought, sold, and owned by one person. This fundamental disagreement would lead to conflict, loss, and the slow unraveling of a way of life that had lasted for centuries. The first Europeans to try and build a permanent home in Delaware came from the Netherlands. In 1631, a group of Dutch traders established a small settlement near what is now the town of Lewis. They called it Zwanendale, which means Valley of the Swans. Their goal was to set up a whaling station and trade for valuable furs with the Lenape people. But this first attempt ended in tragedy. A misunderstanding between the Dutch settlers and a local Native American group led to a conflict, and the entire settlement was destroyed within a year. The Dutch dream of a colony on the bay seemed to have vanished before it could truly begin, leaving only a memory of what might have been. A few years later, in 1638, a different European flag was raised on the western shore of the Delaware River. This time, it was the flag of Sweden. Led by a man named Peter Minuit who had previously worked for the Dutch, Swedish settlers arrived and built a fort they named Fort Christina, in honor of their young queen. This settlement, located in present-day Wilmington, became the heart of a colony called New Sweden. The Swedes, along with Finnish settlers who came with them, introduced a new style of building to America, the log cabin. They managed to create a peaceful relationship with the Lenape, trading for furs and farming the land in a way that did not immediately lead to conflict. For about 17 years, New Sweden grew slowly along the river. The settlers cleared small plots of land for their farms, raising tobacco and grain. They established a few more small forts and trading posts, stretching their influence up and down the river. Unlike other colonies, New Sweden was not very large, and it never received the full support it needed from its home country across the ocean. The colonists were often short on supplies and new settlers. Despite these challenges, they created a unique European outpost in the New World. A small piece of Scandinavia nestled between the growing English colonies to the south and the Dutch colonies to the north. Their presence was quiet but significant. However, the Dutch had never forgotten their own claim to the Delaware River Valley. The governor of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, a fiery man named Peter Stuyvesant, saw the Swedish colony as a threat to Dutch trade and territory. In the summer of 1655, Stuyvesant sailed down from New Amsterdam with a fleet of ships and soldiers. He arrived at Fort Christina and demanded that the Swedes surrender. Outnumbered and without any hope of receiving help from Sweden, the governor of New Sweden had no choice but to give up. The Swedish flag was lowered and the Dutch flag was raised once more. The colony of New Sweden was no more, absorbed into the larger Dutch territory. The Dutch rule over the Delaware region would not last long. The English, who had powerful colonies in Virginia and New England, also had their eyes on the valuable land between them. In 1664, England and the Netherlands were at war, and an English fleet sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam. The Dutch, under Governor Peter Stuyvesant, were once again forced to surrender without a fight. With that, all of New Netherland, including the settlements along the Delaware River, came under English control. The Duke of York, the brother of the English king, was given this vast new territory. The land that would one day become Delaware was now part of a growing English empire in America. For the people living in Delaware, the remaining Swedes, Finns, and Dutch, life did not change dramatically at first. The English allowed them to keep their farms, their customs, and their local languages. The real change came in 1681, when a man named William Penn received a huge grant of land from the King of England to pay off a debt. This land became Pennsylvania. Penn, a Quaker who believed in peace and fairness, wanted his new colony to have access to the ocean. He successfully petitioned the Duke of York to also grant him the land along the western shore of the Delaware Bay, which was then known as the Three Lower Counties. This arrangement created a new problem. The powerful Calvert family, who owned the neighboring colony of Maryland, claimed that the land of the Three Lower Counties was actually part of their original charter from the king. This began a long and complicated border dispute between the Penn family of Pennsylvania and the Calvert family of Maryland. For decades, the two families argued over the exact location of the border. Settlers in the disputed area were often unsure which colony they belonged to, which led to confusion over laws, taxes, and land ownership. The argument was a constant source of tension between the two colonies. To finally solve this problem, the Penn and Calvert families agreed in the 1760s to hire two English surveyors, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, to draw a definitive boundary. For several years, Mason and Dixon carefully measured the land, using the best scientific instruments of their time. They placed stone markers to create what became known as the Mason-Dixon line, the famous border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. They also surveyed the unique circular northern border of Delaware, known as the 12-mile circle, which had been established in Penn's original deed. This careful work finally settled the long-standing dispute and gave Delaware the distinct borders that it has today. Even though Delaware was governed by Pennsylvania, the people of the three lower counties began to feel a sense of their own unique identity. They were geographically separate from the main population centers of Pennsylvania around Philadelphia. Their economy was also different, relying more on tobacco farming, which connected them culturally more to the southern colonies like Maryland and Virginia. The people of Delaware grew tired of having their laws made by an assembly in Philadelphia where they felt their voices were not always heard. They wanted more control over their own affairs and to make decisions that were best for their own communities. This desire for independence grew stronger over the years. In 1704, William Penn agreed to allow the three lower counties to have their own separate legislative assembly. While they still shared the same governor with Pennsylvania, they could now pass their own laws. This was a major step toward self-government. The assembly met in the town of New Castle, which became the colonial capital. This created a unique situation. Delaware was not quite a fully independent colony, but it was no longer just a part of Pennsylvania. It was a semi-independent region, a colony within a colony, slowly forging its own path and its own political traditions. When tensions with Great Britain began to rise in the 1760s and 1770s, Delaware was ready to stand with the other colonies. Like their neighbors, Delawareans were angry about British taxes and laws, such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. They felt that they were being taxed without having any representatives in the British Parliament to speak for them. Delaware sent delegates to the Continental Congress to discuss a unified response to British actions. Leaders like Caesar Rodney, Thomas McKean, and George Read became important voices in the growing movement for American independence, representing Delaware's strong desire for liberty. The most dramatic moment for Delaware came in July 1776. The Continental Congress was voting on the Declaration of Independence. Delaware's 3 delegates were divided. George Reed was hesitant to break completely from Britain, while Thomas McKean was strongly in favor of independence. The 3rd delegate, Caesar Rodney, was back in Delaware, suffering from illness. Realizing the vote was tied, McKean sent an urgent message to Rodney, who then rode 80 miles through a thunderstorm on horseback. He arrived in Philadelphia just in time to break the tie and cast Delaware's deciding vote in favor of independence. This heroic ride ensured that Delaware stood with the other colonies in declaring freedom from British rule. After the American Revolution was won, the newly independent colonies faced the challenge of creating a new government. They first tried a system called the Articles of Confederation, but it was just, well, too weak. In 1787, delegates from the states met in Philadelphia to write a new constitution. Delaware, being a small state, was very concerned about how the new government would be structured. Its leaders wanted to make sure that larger states like Virginia and Pennsylvania could not dominate the smaller ones. So they argued for a system where every state, no matter its size, would have an equal voice in at least one part of the government. The final United States Constitution included this compromise, creating a Senate where every state had 2 senators. This made the small states, including Delaware, feel much more secure. Because they were pleased with this fair system, Delaware's leaders moved quickly to approve the new constitution. On December 7, 1787, Delaware became the very first state to ratify the United States Constitution, earning it the proud nickname it holds to this day, the First State. This quick action helped build momentum for the Constitution's approval in other states and cemented Delaware's important role in the founding of the United States of America. In the years that followed, Delaware's economy began to change. While farming remained important, a new kind of industry was taking root along the Brandywine River near Wilmington. In 1802, a French immigrant named Eleuthère Irénée Dupont founded a company to make gunpowder. He had learned the latest French techniques for making high-quality black powder, and his mills on the Brandywine were a great success. The E.I. Dupont de Nemours and Company, or simply DuPont, grew rapidly, especially during times of conflict like the War of 1812 and the Civil War, when the demand for gunpowder was high. This company would eventually grow into one of the largest chemical companies in the world. Another major economic development for Delaware was the construction of the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. For years, people had dreamed of a waterway that could connect the Chesapeake Bay with the Delaware River. This would create a shortcut for ships traveling between Baltimore and Philadelphia, saving them a long and dangerous trip around the Delmarva Peninsula. Work on the canal began in the 1820s, and it was a massive undertaking, requiring thousands of workers to dig through miles of earth. When it opened in 1829, the C&D Canal became a vital artery for trade and commerce, helping to fuel the growth of Wilmington and the entire region. It remains an important shipping route even today. For most of its early history, Delaware was a place of small towns and farms. Its population grew slowly but steadily, made up of people from many different backgrounds. The descendants of the early Swedish, Finnish, and Dutch settlers were joined by a larger wave of English, Welsh, and Scots-Irish immigrants. These groups spread out across the 3 counties, creating a cultural landscape that was, really unique. The northern county of New Castle was more influenced by the Quaker culture of Pennsylvania, with a focus on trade and small industry. The 2 southern counties, Kent and Sussex, were more rural and agricultural, with an economy and way of life that resembled the nearby southern states. A significant portion of Delaware's population from the colonial era onward was made up of people of African descent. Most were brought to the state as enslaved laborers, forced to work on the tobacco plantations of southern Delaware and as servants and workers in the towns. However, Delaware also had one of the largest populations of free black people of any state before the Civil War. This was partly due to the influence of Quakers and Methodists who opposed slavery and encouraged slaveholders to free their enslaved workers. By 1860, there were nearly 20,000 free black residents in Delaware, far outnumbering the roughly 1,800 who remained enslaved. The 19th century brought new waves of immigrants to Delaware, drawn by the promise of jobs in the state's growing industries. The DuPont powder mills, the shipyards in Wilmington, and the construction of the railroads and the C&D Canal all required a large workforce. Irish immigrants came in large numbers, especially during the Great Famine in their homeland, and they provided much of the labor for these massive projects. Later in the century, they were followed by immigrants from Germany, Italy, and Poland, who settled in Wilmington and other industrial towns. This influx of new people made the city of Wilmington a diverse and bustling center of industry and culture. This pattern of population change continued into the 20th century. The growth of large corporations like DuPont and later the rise of the financial services industry attracted people from all over the country and the world to Delaware. The state's population, which had been relatively small for much of its history, began to grow more rapidly. The majority of this growth was concentrated in the northern part of the state, in Newcastle County, while the southern counties of Kent and Sussex remained more rural. This created a state with two distinct characters, a fast-paced suburban north and a quieter, more agricultural south, a division that continues to shape Delaware's politics and culture today. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Delaware found itself in a difficult and complicated position. It was a state caught in the middle, both geographically and culturally. Geographically, it was located north of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Culturally, it had deep ties to both the North and the South. Its northern county, with its factories and immigrant populations, was strongly connected to the industrial North. Its southern counties, with their agricultural economy and history of slavery, had more in common with the South. This internal division made Delaware a border state, a place where loyalties were deeply split. Although Delaware was a slave state, it was a state where slavery was already fading away. By 1860, as mentioned, the number of enslaved people was very small compared to the large population of free African Americans. Many people in Delaware, especially in the North, were against slavery and supported the Union. However, there was also strong sympathy for the Southern cause, particularly in Kent and Sussex counties. Some Delawareans believed that states had the right to secede from the Union, while others simply had family and economic ties to the South. The state was a house divided, reflecting the larger conflict that was tearing the nation apart. Despite these divisions, Delaware officially remained in the Union. The state legislature voted against secession. President Abraham Lincoln worked hard to keep the border states like Delaware loyal, as they were critical to the defense of Washington, D.C. While the state government stayed with the Union, the people of Delaware fought on both sides of the war. Thousands of men from Delaware volunteered to fight for the Union Army, serving bravely in famous battles like Antietam and Gettysburg. At the same time, a smaller number of men crossed the border into Maryland and Virginia to join the Confederate Army, fighting for the cause they believed in. During the war, Delaware's industries played an important role in the Union war effort. The DuPont Company became the largest supplier of gunpowder to the Union Army, its mills on the Brandywine running day and night to produce the powder needed for the fight. Wilmington's shipyards built ironclad ships for the Union Navy, and its factories produced railroad cars, clothing, and other essential supplies. In 1865, just before the end of the war, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was proposed, which would abolish slavery everywhere in the United States. Delaware's legislature, still showing its divided feelings, actually voted against the amendment. However, the amendment was ratified by enough other states to become law, and the last remaining enslaved people in Delaware were finally freed. After the Civil War and the end of slavery, African Americans in Delaware were free, but they were not equal. A new system of racial separation known as segregation began to take hold. This system was enforced by laws and social customs that kept black and white people separate in many aspects of life. In Delaware, this meant there were separate schools, separate churches, and separate public places like restaurants and theaters. Black people were often denied the right to vote through unfair rules and intimidation. They faced discrimination in getting jobs and housing. This period, which lasted for many decades, was a time of great hardship and injustice for Delaware's black community. The biggest and most damaging part of this system was the segregation of schools. Delaware's state constitution required that separate schools be maintained for white and black children. The schools for white children received much more funding from the state. They had better buildings, more books, and more experienced teachers. The schools for black children were often small, run down, and lacked basic supplies. This unequal system was designed to limit the opportunities of African Americans and keep them in a lower position in society. Despite these challenges, the black community in Delaware worked hard to educate its children, often raising their own money to support their schools. The fight against segregation in Delaware was a long and courageous struggle. In the 1950s, a brave group of African-American parents, with the help of a lawyer named Louis L. Redding, decided to challenge the state's segregated school system in court. They argued that the separate schools were not equal and that this violated the United States Constitution. One of these cases involved a young girl who had to travel a long distance to her segregated school, even though a much better equipped white school was located much closer to her home. These Delaware cases were eventually combined with others from around the country into the famous Supreme Court case known as Brown v. Board of Education. In 1954, the Supreme Court made its historic decision, declaring that separate schools were inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. This ruling meant that Delaware, like other states, had to begin the process of integrating its schools, bringing black and white students together in the same classrooms. This process, known as desegregation, was not easy. It was met with resistance in some parts of the state, and it took many years to fully achieve. The struggle for school integration in Delaware was a key battle in the larger civil rights movement, a fight for justice and equality that would change the state and the nation forever. From the ancient villages of the Lenape people to its modern role as a center of business and finance, Delaware's history is a story of remarkable change. It is the story of a small piece of land that has played an outsized role in the American narrative. It was here that different European cultures, Dutch, Swedish, and English, first competed for a foothold in the New World. It was here that a unique identity was forged, separate from its larger neighbors, leading to the creation of a distinct colony that fiercely guarded its independence. Delaware's journey is a testament to the idea that size does not determine significance. The state's role in the birth of the United States is its most famous chapter. By being the first to ratify the Constitution, this small state led the way for the entire nation, earning its title as the first state. This pivotal moment was followed by a wave of innovation, as the mills along the Brandywine River and the canal connecting two great bays transformed its economy. It became a place where industry thrived, drawing people from all over the world to its shores and creating a diverse and dynamic population. This blend of agricultural tradition and industrial might has defined Delaware for much of its history. Like the nation itself, Delaware has also wrestled with deep and painful divisions. As a border state, it was a microcosm of the conflicts that led to the Civil War, with loyalties split between North and South. In the century that followed, it struggled with the legacy of slavery and the injustice of segregation. The courageous fight for equal rights and school integration in Delaware became a critical part of the national civil rights movement, showing that the battle for America's soul was fought not just in the Deep South, but in communities all across the country. These struggles have shaped the state in profound ways. Today, Delaware continues its journey. It is a state of contrasts, where quiet coastal towns and vast farmlands in the south exist alongside the bustling corporate and suburban landscape of the north. Its history is visible everywhere, in the old Colonial courthouse in Newcastle, in the preserved powder mills on the Brandywine, and in the names of its towns and rivers that echo its Lenape and European past. The story of Delaware is the story of America in miniature, a tale of conflict and compromise, of hardship and progress, and of a continuous effort to live up to the ideals upon which it was the first to build a foundation.